The North Gauteng High Court in Pretoria has this week granted the government's application to place the South African Post Office in business rescue. This move puts a halt to ongoing liquidation proceedings and now paves the way for a 2.4 billion rand taxpayer bailout. Now, the state made business rescue a condition for providing further bailouts to avoid messy liquidations. The process is most likely to come with significant job cuts. South African Post Office is just one case in the ongoing crisis faced by the country's SOEs. Just this week, media reports following a leaked document revealed that the SABC may also be facing business rescue. The chair of Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Alex van den Heever, joins us now to talk about this further. Prof, great to have you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Good morning.
So the court's decision to grant the government's application to place SAPO in business rescue, putting a stop to the ongoing liquidation. Perhaps explain in simple terms the difference in these scenarios: a bailout, business rescue and liquidation.
So the business rescue means you attempt to keep the business as a going concern and change its fortunes. The bailout would only be part of such a strategy. And a liquidation is when you effectively terminate the company, you sell it off. Yeah. And you could sell off the pieces, or you could sell off parts of it that are a going concern. So those would be the bailout is part of the option to try and keep the business going.
Yeah. So if we look at the decision that has been made with regard to SAPO, do you think this is the best route to be taken for this entity?
So I don't think that it's necessarily a bad choice at this point in time. The problem really becomes what do they intend to do, even in a rescue process with the South African Post Office? Because the problem with business rescues is that they are not necessarily innovative reorganizers of a business. They sort of chop it up and they sort of make it leaner and try and keep it going. And what the Post Office has needed for a considerable period of time, as with many of the other state-owned entities, is to become a more dynamic organization. And part of why they're not dynamic is that very often the top management and administrations and their supervisory boards are not really given, are the wrong people in many cases, and in other cases don't have the discretion to properly run those businesses in a strategic manner. In other words, to look innovatively at new options and driving those organizations into the future based on their mission. That's not what's been happening. Yeah. You've had people who are parachuted into those organizations with political agendas and very often poor understanding of the organizations. So the rescue itself doesn't bring in innovation, doesn't bring in a dynamic mode. What it does is it brings in people who kind of can restore the balance sheet supposedly in a short term. One doesn't even know what discretion they have to even do that.
Yeah, and then of course the taxpayers' money is again put in there as a bailout, and who knows where that's going to lead the organization, and if in fact it'll actually start working again. I mean, when we look at the state of the Post Office, is there any way that entity can be fixed and get working again?
Well, I think that the Post Office could have had a valid role. It now operates in an environment where it's got many competitors, and they don't directly compete. There are many alternatives to people to send their mail or their parcels. And those organizations are flourishing outside of the Post Office. So if the Post Office was dynamic and focusing on kind of trying to find its place in the world, it would need to be a very different place. I think that it can turn itself around, but I'm not sure that it's just sufficient to give it bailouts. It needs a completely new vision, and it needs people who can give it that vision. Business rescue operators don't give you that vision. So all you might end up with is some cutting here and there, if they're even allowed to do that properly, because the bailout may be used to prevent them from cutting unnecessary staff and reorganizing the leadership of that organization. But so that means that we will be dealing with a further bailout requirement 2 to 3 years from now, again, or even 12 months from now, if they basically can't inject a completely new dynamic into the organization. I'm not so sure that that's what the result is going to be.
And that's the reality. I mean, billions have been spent on the South African Post Office trying to turn it around, trying to make it into an entity that makes sense, because it doesn't make sense as it is right now. But there are thousands of jobs at stake, and that's the reality, is that, you know, you're stuck in that kind of situation where you keep on throwing money into this entity. It's not turning around. I mean, never mind even a profit. That doesn't even make sense. But it's the jobs that are on the line now. I mean, thousands of jobs set to be lost due to this. But let's sort of, we leave that there, because that's still the ongoing story, and we move on to another entity which I talked to you from. It's the SABC. I mean, we see a leaked document which was saying that the SABC is now in financial crisis again, and this time there has not been any overt or known governance transgressions as seen in the recent past. I mean, what do you make of what's happening with the SABC and the whole situation that's unfolding here?
Yeah, SABC I put in a different position to Transnet. There's a greater degree of autonomy and a different governance structure, which suggests that the SABC could be far better run and overseen. But government itself, the president failed to appoint the board for months and months and months, and that clearly put the organization in jeopardy. A supervisory board in an organization, a public organization like the SABC, critically requires the board, in order to be able to drive positive strategy and agendas, and to deal with the basics of its finances. But when you abandon the organization and let it languish for that period, it basically just hovers. And the SABC hasn't been stable. It's been in a position where it's needed to reinvigorate itself as well. It's an organization that is absolutely pivotal and critical to South Africa's democracy, and it needs to have that both its autonomy and independence as a public broadcaster, but it also needs to have the governance structure to manage it in a financially viable way. So it's a mystery as to why the board wasn't appointed for such a long period. I would be concerned with a business rescue approach in the case of SABC, because government itself has been part of causing this situation. And the question now is, what is the best route forward? But I think that a lot needs to be placed, a lot of the onus to make the reorganization, the re-strategizing of the organization has to be placed on the board itself, rather than a bunch of business rescue operators. But I'd be very concerned if the purpose behind a so-called business rescue is to kind of capture the organization before elections. This must remain an independent organization. And it must remain financially viable, and it can't be strangled when it doesn't necessarily suit the interests of some people. That's just a concern, not necessarily an allegation.
Yeah, that is always an issue, and particularly, as you say, I mean, we are now possibly just over a year to the huge elections that will be coming up, and this is certainly seen as a tool and an educator of the nation, but also used for political interests. But if we had to look at the funding model of the SABC, what could change? What should change in how it works? I mean, we look at something like the revenue collection of TV licenses, which, I mean, we saw there's billions outstanding. People don't want to pay their TV licenses, and there's lots of different ideas that are moving around. But if we had to look at the funding model, what should change there?
Well, the funding model effectively depends on a very large degree of willingness to pay, a voluntary payment of what could be seen as a tax. And as one sees with the tolls on the N1, is that if you create that sort of arrangement, expect a considerable degree of non-compliance. So if you're going to have public funding for a public broadcaster, you need to have a more direct level of revenue. But you also need, because it's public money that's going in, not government oversight. You need very strong oversight that the funds are actually going to be deployed in the public interest in the way in which you expect a public broadcaster to do, because it's not a state organization. It's not meant to be doing the business of any political party. And it must be also serving interests as a public broadcaster that a private broadcaster would not serve. So that role itself is where the funds need to be deployed, and that needs to be supervised and part of a sort of a proper process. So I think that if it should have a more certain revenue stream, not one that relies on voluntary consent, voluntary compliance. It does need something more reliable from that side. The other sides are, there is a commercial side to SABC as well, and that commercial side also depends on its content and its overall approach. And that's where the board becomes absolutely critical, because it's really the one that must form part of the strategizing process with the organization to balance both the public aspects and the commercial aspects of SABC. You need a very active board and fully engaged, not business rescuers.
Yeah. Gosh, we could continue talking about that, but there's just so many SOEs to get through. But I want you to very quickly touch on SAA, South African Airways. I mean, we've been seeing a new route that's launched, South Africa, Brazil. The internal routes seem to be doing well. What have you made of their business rescue? I mean, are you sort of seeing it and seeing a little bit of hope on the horizon with regard to SAA?
Well, South African Airways effectively now competes against other very effective airlines, and in many respects has been overtaken by them. So first of all, South African Airways was not sufficiently dynamic to not to give way to those. But we don't. There's a question as to whether or not we need a South African Airways as a sort of government type, a South African airline, but it could be branded that way. But I think that it could survive. It could remain viable. But in essence, there's no real public need that is satisfied by South African Airways. It's not going to be satisfied by a range of other competitors, many of whom are doing extremely well.
Yeah. Just in general, quite interesting. I was busy reading something that the finance minister was saying. He was doing a reply in Parliament, and just one statement that he made was that he believes, Enoch Godongwada, that there are too many state-owned entities in South Africa. That's what he has said. He said government probably has far too many public entities, especially given our fiscal circumstances. We haven't even touched on Transnet, Eskom. I mean, there are so many more. Do you agree with what the minister is saying?
Yeah, so first of all, when you create a state-owned entity, you've got to have a reason for it. There must be a problem you're trying to solve. You can't just have state-owned entities because you like state-owned entities. And that has been the approach that government has taken for, I'm afraid, 30 years. The purposes behind government's involvement, government's hand in certain of these organizations is a mystery, because you don't need them. They're not actually serving any real public purpose. So government should actually be deploying its resources very strategically to those areas where pure private activity is not going to be sufficient to deal with the particular public need. So when you look at that, you say, well, should government be controlling all of the rolling stock on railways? Should government be running an airline? Should government be running a post office when we've got lots of other alternatives? Or should they just be one competitor amongst many? Government does have to have a real reason to be involved, because what's happening is the way in which government has got involved has in many cases destroyed those organizations. They cease to function effectively. And government does need to focus. It must get away from trying to run too much in the economy that is basically not its business.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in 2021, the president appointed an advisory SOE council. That's what the president likes to do, is appoint these councils. What has its role been? I mean, has it done anything to help improve the life of these SOEs? Eskom, Denel, SABC, SAPO, PRASA, Transnet, the list goes on. What has it done?
Well, I think that government vacillated on how to deal with these issues. There are various vested interests in state organizations and state-owned entities, many vested interests, including criminal interests that are tied into the ANC and sort of political interests and other political parties that really want to retain these organizations as cash cows. So, yeah, it becomes a difficult issue as to whether or not there's a real will to understand how you deal with state organizations. Note that the reason that you would establish a public entity of some form is a form of decentralization within government. You're creating something with a very particular mandate and purpose, and you're attempting to solve a very particular problem. So it means you've got to have a reason. You don't just do it because because government should be involved in everything. You've got to have a specific reason. And I'd say that there hasn't been that. And I'd say that establishing a council to deal with this just shows you don't actually have a vision at all. Because I think that in many of these instances, you'd have rather implemented a strategy to basically get rid of these, push these organizations into either, if they're competing with private players, privatize them, get rid of them, get them off the government balance sheet, and let government then focus on its core business, which it isn't doing in many of these cases. It's really unclear why we need to have the executive of government's hand in so many organizations of this nature, and they are now in the way. They are part of holding back South Africa's economic growth and development. So every time you hear people talking about we need to address structural issues in the South African economy, in many cases now, it is these organizations that are structurally impacting negatively on South Africa's ability to grow. Transnet is one of them. PRASA is another. The security services that don't protect our private sector organizations from being able to invest in infrastructure. All of these things are now caused by government's hand that doesn't get out of the way of letting society move forward.
All right, we've got to leave it there. I allowed you to speak and make your point, and I think you made it very, very well there. That, of course, the chair of Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Alex van den Heever.